Okay, well, thank you all for joining us for this fourth panel session of the Future Automated Mobilities Symposium. My name's Michael Richardson, and I'm an Associate Professor of Media at UNSW in Sydney and an Associate Investigator with ADM+S Centre. We're meeting today on unceded and sovereign lands of the Wiradjuri and Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation. And as we have throughout this event, I'd like to acknowledge elders past and present and extend that respect to any First Nations people joining us today. And in making that recognition, I also want to emphasize that country is not just land and sea and the life that it sustains, but also air and sky. And mastering air and sky have long been colonial imperatives. Yet these atmospheric spaces above us are less controlled and less occupied than their terrestrial counterparts, at least in some ways. The question of whether that remains the case, though, is very much before us. And this panel on automated aerial futures is going to explore that question of what happens to the sky. Aerial transit, mapping and monitoring are not new, as the long history of aviation and satellite technology attests. But in the last decade or so, the accelerating development of uninhabited and autonomous aerial systems is changing the future of the sky. So according to modelling by Deloitte Access Economics, the Australian drone industry will be worth up to $14.5 billion by 2040, supporting something like 5,500 jobs on average each year between now and then. Drones are projected to transform industries as diverse as agriculture, mining, defence, freight, health and consumer delivery. And in many cases, that change is already underway. Whether those economic numbers are correct is perhaps open to much debate, but those sort of imagined economies are incredibly powerful. Articulated in industry and consultant reports and white papers, the value they promise draws investment, it shapes regulation, and it directs invention and innovation. But it also risks regulatory and standards capture by big players, with technological development outpacing parliamentary interest and public awareness and so on. In short, we don't yet have a robust, informed debate about what the future of the sky above us looks, sounds, and feels like. And Australia is in urgent need of that careful examination of aerial futures. We need to think carefully and collaboratively about the emerging technologies, regulatory agendas, corporate initiatives, and also the potentially reparative and life-saving applications that animate those imagined futures. Controlling the air has always been about power, because the view from above enables those with access to it to know and do more in certain ways than those on the ground. Or at least they have the illusion of knowing more, depending on the situation. We heard about some of the humanitarian potential of drones and other geospatial technologies yesterday in Ivana's presentation about Humanitech. But those same technologies, of course, have a much longer, more brutal history in war and security. These histories of aerial technologies are important to bear in mind, I think, because the ideas and problems and solutions that drive them can easily carry over into how aerial mobilities operate in places very far from battlefields. In other words, we need critical attention on the structural, technical, social, contextual, and environmental dimensions of aerial futures. And I think we need to do it in a holistic, multifaceted way. As we'll talk about in this panel, I think, the question of power is crucial. Who holds it in shaping aerial futures? How is it harnessed and actualized through technologies themselves? And how might people go about taking it back? The complexity of these issues and the many potential implications for the lives of people, plants, animals, and the textures of the worlds we all inhabit make it vital that voices from the humanities and social sciences are part of the conversation. And to that end, I'm joined by three brilliant colleagues to talk about some of these questions. Associate Professor Julia Powles from University of Western Australia, Associate Professor Chris Agius from Swinburne University, and Dr. Tim Neale from Deakin, accompanied by his research assistant, Julian, on stage here. So the format for this session is straightforward. Julia, Chris, and Tim will each speak for a few minutes to offer some provocations about aerial automated futures. Then we'll have some discussion amongst the panel before turning to you in the audience for questions. So there's plenty of time to think through what you would like to ask and what you'd like us to get into further. So let's get into it. Julia Powles directs the Minderoo Tech and Policy Lab at the University of Western Australia. She works on privacy, intellectual property, internet governance, and the law and politics of data, automation, and artificial intelligence. So she's busy. And as you'd have heard yesterday, Julia loves to ask an excellent question. So Julia, over to you.
Thanks so much, Michael. And I really want to thank the organisers. We've been locked up in WA, and Tao and Sarah, Julian and all the team. It's so nice to see this centre that I've been watching online in action and see the vibrant activities, particularly of this research stream. So as is best practice, let me start with a couple of transparency statements. The first is I'm a full-time academic, as Michael said, at UWA. 60% of my time is committed to directing the lab that he mentioned, the UWA Minderoo Tech and Policy Lab. We're an independent interdisciplinary research centre, and half of our funding comes from the Australian Philanthropy Minderoo Foundation on a gift, and the other half comes from the university and government grants. Second is that our research at the lab involves a wide range of people. I co-lead the centre with a biomechanist and bioengineer, Professor Jacqueline Alderson. And we have a number of projects actually in the transport and mobility space. I'll mainly speak to the drones projects, but I did want to mention in recognition of the through line of ride-hailing that we've heard about over the last couple of days, two of my students, Helen Stamp and Tom Loss, who are doing really interesting projects on Uber's many liabilities. So my key argument and sort of opening point is that the dominant anticipatory visions, and Michael really touched on this, of transport and mobility, conceive of the sky as a void, empty and unowned, rather than as a vital habitat, a commons, a sanctuary, as someone else's country. And compounding this vision and lack of vision, we have both a regulatory problem and a corporate capture problem. My argument is that the net effect of this constrained vision, limited regulation, and tremendous capture is that our vast skies are really very vulnerable to overzealous economic development narratives that have serious collective costs for hope, justice and care. And I think it's no accident that Australia is the test site for this particular battle. So I want to speak particularly to the regulatory and capture problem a bit more. The regulatory problem is really is legal, institutional and political. As one of our team members, Anna Zenz, is documenting, air mobility regulation is really conceived as a sort of narrower subset of aviation regulation more broadly. So it focuses very particularly on the problem of safety, as if we have just tiny planes. And it's got a bit of salt and pepper for noise and privacy. But there are a lot of issues that are off the table, and that's reflected in the absence of institutions that can deal with issues beyond safety, noise and privacy. In particular, entirely absent from our legal and regulatory framework are contexts for considering really essential questions. First and foremost, what are the impacts of tens of thousands of drones, as are in the visioning of Australian-based companies, on amenity? A second key issue, which I'm investigating with the chair of the National Native Title Council, Cato Muir, is what are the implications for native title? A little tiny aside on Australian law. We don't have the American principle of down to the core of the earth and up to the skies above our land holdings, but native title may well have that. And third, in the framework of safety, how are we precluding the ultimate question, which is, do we want to fill our skies with drones? And I'm particularly focused on delivery drones. I have a history of looking at case studies, particularly around big tech, particularly around Google, and the major entity in this space and the key operator is Google with its program Wing. So we have three key streams of work in the lab that centre, I really think on this. I love this theme of care, justice and hope, and I hope that the ADM+S ADM+S Centre really takes them forward. I can imagine a new, beyond fairness, accountability, transparency, to care, justice and hope. So the first, which really utilises the expertise of members of our team, Dr. Nardine Al-Namir and Dr. Hannah Smith, on deliberative democracy. We have a project to run a citizens' jury on urban drones. And here I am taking the opportunity of the fact that WA is the last city on the map for many big tech companies, so we'll be the site of resistance, but also to really imagine the complexity of the many issues that surround urban delivery drones. And you may not be aware, but in the national aviation, this is best epitomised to me in the National Aviation Policy Framework, which first envisioned in late 2020 that the people would come to accept drones because we come to accept, delivery drones in particular, because we accept emergency helicopter landings of essential medical supplies. And very quickly they spoke about these projected Deloitte Access Economics predictions on the delivery of burritos and coffee and donuts. Public health is, I think, a really imperative consideration in this. So we really want that to be a very expansive project. I won't talk much more to it at this point because I want to get more into the policy. So the second stream of work is on policy interventions, and we've had some success there at the federal level and also some state work. And the third, with my co-director, Professor Alderson, we're interested in working with rhetorical software, which is really a way of intervening, especially in a place that is captured by industry, as effectively industry participants. So in the valueless promotion of the economic development of drones, combined with the fact that Western Australia is the only contemporary democracy without a Privacy Act, we are looking to launch a drone company that does all sorts of dastardly things and see if that doesn't mobilise some response. So the final bit, my final minute, is I just want to give you a little bit on the last 2 years as we've tracked the policy development. So Google Wing has made nearly 300,000 commercial deliveries through its app Wing. More than 2/3 of those are in Australia, so it's very much the test site. And their whole narrative is about ensuring community tolerance for drones. The federal government in late 2020 put out a NEAT, National Emerging Aviation Policy, which proposed that the role of the federal government should be to ensure the promotion of this drone industry. Our first intervention was to raise a constitutional issue about the way that it was seeking to cover the field that also state and local governments really have a say in. And that was quite successful in turning around that now the role of the federal government is to ensure that it has a drone rule management system. And so I encourage everyone who is motivated to respond to issues of drones to think about creating some drone rules at the local and state level, because one of their bets, I think, is that the complexity of that challenge at a sort of granular local level will mean that there'll still be effectively a federal strategy. And the other really concerning thing that happened, I think, in the last 2 years is that the Department of Infrastructure has had people from Google Wing effectively writing the policy side by side with them. And many of you will know the case study of Sidewalk in the City of Toronto, and that really looks like quite a professional operation when you compare it to what's happening with our federal Department of Infrastructure. But the final point I want to note is that actually state governments are probably even worse than the federal governments. And I've got this archive of letters of courtly love from various ministers for economic development, started in Queensland 2 months ago here in Victoria, where they essentially say, we cannot achieve this future without you. Victoria welcomes you, drone industry of the future. And there's really, I think, no public response to these. So they are so extraordinary in the gambit and clearly anticipate effectively a singular sort of two-way dialogue between industry and those who see only economic opportunity. I think there's so many more issues that are really on the table.
Brilliant. Thank you, Julia. So much to think about there. Next up, we have Chris Agius. Chris is an Associate Professor in International Relations at Swinburne University. Chris researches critical perspectives on international security, particularly around drone warfare, gender, borders, and bordering practices. So we're going to push briefly a bit more into a military space, which I think is really important when we are considering these aerial issues.
Thanks, Michael. Yeah, it's been absolutely terrific to have this opportunity to talk about themes of care, justice and hope, because in the work and research that I do, there's not a lot of that in relation to the things that I sort of, examine. I look at, as Michael mentioned, drone warfare, militarisation, and I'm very interested in the logics that underpin this, as well as very much around also the narratives and ideas around what we do to protect. And I think in that relationship, I think listening to all the presentations over the symposium so far, I've been really inspired to see that technology can be put to all sorts of really innovative uses, but I still would like to perhaps do a bit of a provocation around what we mean when we think about care and how we interpret care. So what does it mean? How do we define it? Because when we turn, I think, to a more militarised or securitized sense of care, the tone alters differently. I think a lot of the applications that we've looked at across the symposium so far are genuinely, causes for good, things that will improve society. But I just wanted to speak a little bit more, I think, on why we need to be more careful when we think about care. So when it comes to the question of drones, we are dealing in one sense with, an ontologically insecure object or category. Drones are either very much like weapons or guns, for instance, seen as either being possessed with agency or being the creation of humans. And at that point, we've, throughout this, I think, symposium, debated the ideas of, human agency, the human in the loop, human ideas and how they construct this. So perhaps thinking about drones in this way as complex social assemblages. They rely on scientific knowledge, they rely on human labour, they rely on capital investment and economic imperatives, and even gendered understandings of the relationship between technology, violence and doing good, which is a sort of area I tend to sort of look at when I'm focusing on drones as well. And I'm always up against this binary when I put forward this idea of an ontological question over the object of the drone. We know that drones can be used as good or bad objects, very much in the same way as any technology or any object can do about that. So I think one of the things I wanted to focus on talking today is thinking about the logics and the narratives that we construct around drone usage, especially in relationship, I think, to how I look at drones in the military and security sense of the term. In this sense here, as we head towards talking about drones as well, developing greater autonomous capability as well, relying on algorithms, and increasingly we know that drone warfare has relied on signature strikes as opposed to personality strikes, and we are seeing increasingly automated decision making as part of this. I think Louise Moore's work around cloud ethics, for instance, tells us that, we should not start from the question of, for instance, how algorithms are arranged for a good society, but rather how algorithmic arrangements generate ideas of goodness, transgression, and what society ought to be. So Moore thinks of the algorithm as an already constituted ethico-political entity. And I think with that, we have to think about this perhaps not necessarily this binary, but this rather this separation between logic and autonomy and how we construct our ideas or stories around them, because a lot of those ideas and stories do a lot of the work around drone warfare as well. So while we can debate the extent to which how much the human is in technology such as drones, I'm consistently drawn to this logic. And that to me speaks of what a lot of the themes of this symposium talk about, these anticipational futures, because I think it's the logics that are really driving the purpose and the use of things like drones and drones in warfare as well. So for instance, I can simply look at a drone and see it, a militarized drone, and see it as an agent of killing, but in certain interpretations it means something else. In international relations and security studies, when we look at drone warfare, the studies are intensely replete with ideas about the impact of drones on human rights, the impact on the laws of war, for instance, proliferation, sort of drones, the type of drones that are being used, and what they mean for sovereign nation states. But they often miss out the part. They sort of focus on the object itself and what it's doing rather than understand the point to which we got to in order to create that object that does what it does. So for me, logics are important, and it's the logic of how we construct an object or a type of technology that is designed for certain things, even if it's designed for multiple things. What sort of instructions, what sort of ideas are inputted into that? And that, I think, is a difficult question because that relies on interpretation a lot of the time as well. And for me, this comes down, I think, to ideas around narrative. And I realise I'm talking very abstractly here, but I want to perhaps give a bit of an example. In the current war in Ukraine, it's rapidly becoming known as a war of drones. Drones are playing an increasingly important role here. We have, in this week alone, Russia's drone strikes have, been in the news. And in a recent article in Popular Mechanics, for instance, the types of drones, they've listed quite a lot of different drones that are being sort of used by both sides. And as a result of this, for some analysts, they're saying we're currently witnessing in Ukraine a drone war. And this is probably the first large-scale war where proprietary military and commercial drones are used so extensively. Now, that is one thing, and we know that drones have been used in military campaigns for a very long time. But one thing that slightly concerns me is how we've altered our interpretation around the use of drones in Ukraine. So, for instance, there's been crowdfunding to buy drones for Ukraine, and in some senses it's almost changing the narrative, celebrating drones as a weapon of democratization, or not democratization, but a weapon of resistance in that respect there too. So I think we have to think about how we think about these technologies, how the narrative can also change. I mean, in the context of Ukraine, we're thinking perhaps of the rehabilitation of the drone as the good weapon. And it's, in the early days of drone warfare, it's been theorised as almost a liberal weapon of choice, a silver bullet, for instance. And then we have the negative sort of, analyses of it, but we seem to be going back towards this idea of the drone as a virtuous object in this respect here, depending on who gets to use it. So in that regard there, I was thinking the logics are one thing, but the narratives also play a specific role as well. So these technologies are sort of, designed around ideas of what keeps us safe, how to remain safe, for instance. But that also then brings me around to the whole question of what do we mean by care when we're talking about care in relation to these technologies. So, for instance, the requirements for care can emerge from violent circumstances. Drones, for instance, can be touted as solutions to deliver things like combat medicine to military personnel out in the field, things like blood plasma, for instance, which can mean life or death situations to military personnel in war situations and in war zones as well. What we mean by care can be hugely differentiated and problematic. So in a recent discussion about, for instance, Cold War testing of nuclear weapons by the British in Australia and in the Pacific, there was a recent radio program on BBC radio, which I really encourage you to listen to. It was talking about an art installation at Gunners Park in Southend in the UK, which was basically trying to sort of question the sort of colonial logics behind nuclear testing. And it raised the question of what could that funding or what could that knowledge have possibly gone into? It could have gone into industries of care rather than creating nuclear weapons. Now, that statement as part of that exhibition raised a criticism by someone who said, well, developing nuclear weapons is an act of care. It's a care towards our population. So this really creates a very interesting sort of, I think the point I'm trying to get at here is how we understand care can be vastly different. So care can sometimes be violent, and I think we should probably think more broadly about the violence of care. For instance, when we start thinking about drones in relation to policing at certain levels, is that an act of care? Or is that an act of violence that'll be interpreted very differently as well? So I'm just going to stop really and end there and talk about how I'm really concerned about how narratives of care and good outcomes really need to be critically assessed and I think thought about alongside the development of such technologies.
Thanks so much, Chris. Our third speaker is Tim Neale. Tim's a Senior Research Fellow at Deakin University in the Alfred Deakin Institute. Tim researches the intersections between environments, hazards, and power. Tim, over to you.
Thanks, Michael. And yeah, apologies that I haven't been here to the symposium until now. I've been unwell and looking after an unwell baby who's now delightful but distracting. I'm very thankful to be invited. I feel like the odd one out because I'm not a drone researcher. I've come to drones through the ethnographic work I do on emergency management, particularly on fire management. So the last 4 years, I've done participant observation as what's called a fire analyst, which is during fire seasons, you're deployed to predict what fires are going to do. And that's put me in certain conversations about technology in emergency management, and drones have introduced themselves into that space, particularly after the 2019-2020 Black Summer bushfires. Like Christine, I'm really I'm struck by this theme of care and hope, because I think, as you'll hear, I've written something, as you'll hear, possibly care and hope are deployed by emergency management in quite conservative ways, right? That care and hope is something that appears on behalf of the state. Care and hope is something that appears in order to sediment an existing regime of care that is quite costly, politically bipartisan, a very kind of set formation. So I'll read for a bit, and hopefully it will trigger some things for conversation between us, I think. So in turning to the skies to respond to bushfires, Australia's bushfire agencies have typically been guided by a mix of industry lobbying, path dependency, and political calculation, rather than considered analysis or dreams of panopticism. Their aerial presence in our skies began in the 1960s, when these agencies started renting a mix of farmers' small aircraft and medium-sized water bombers from North America. Though the investment was marginal until a series of bad seasons affected Western Victoria and areas neighbouring Sydney in the late 1970s. Responding to public pressure and pirate lobbying, in 1980, the federal government commissioned a $3 million study called Project Aquarius. And as the chief of the CSIRO, the federal science body that was commissioned to do this, commented in an internal brief 4 years later, so 1984, the primary objective was to quieten the clamour for the introduction of large aircraft, also known as LATs, converted 747s. You've probably all seen them in news coverage, dropping, tens of thousands of gallons of usually red retardant onto fires. The secondary objective, apart from to quieten this clamour, was to evaluate their effectiveness. And this was not achieved until the study's final year, as their field trials had to be abandoned, and they ended up having to rely on a Canadian simulator to produce their data. Their internal conclusions, which I've read in the archives, that the study showed no positive basis for investing in air tankers, was absent from subsequent press releases, because crucially, in the years of the study, Australia witnessed the landmark 1983 Ash Wednesday fires, which killed 75 people and launched a range of inquiries. Funding flowed very quickly to aircraft contractors and bushfire agencies alike. And I begin with this episode because it represents, for me, an established pattern or arrangement of events, forces, and interests, ranging from climate patterns that drive the production and drying of flammable biomass, to the political pressure exerted on politicians and agencies to respond, to the variously thwarted and compromised studies that present mixed signals regarding aircraft effectiveness, to the range of inquiry recommendations calling for more funding for aircraft and their supporting infrastructures. Like the emergency responders attempt to put out fires by, in their words, putting wet stuff on hot stuff, agencies and political leaders attempt to cool off politically charged hot situations, such as bushfire events, with a renewed financial commitment to water bombers. It's difficult to gain a full appraisal of the financial cost of this resulting kind of aerial regime, as while there are about 500 aircraft that are annually leased at a cost of about 80 million. These budgets significantly expand during bad seasons, so that for New South Wales alone, in the 2019-2020 season, the aircraft budget was 300 million. The sedimentation of this regime, though, was well demonstrated following that season, while 2 official inquiries each concluded that the efficacy of these large aircraft had still not been extensively evaluated after all these years, and that existing research suggested that they're not effective. The coalition federal government promised a further $11 million in base funding and $20 million to buy 4 new aircraft. This was criticized by many, including on the left and groups like the Emergency Leaders for Climate Action, as too small a commitment. Amongst fire managers, I've found the value of large aircraft is less economic or practical than social, or operational, as they would say, than social. Like the use of the military during emergencies, large aircraft seem to make fire-prone communities feel protected. Like my interlocutors actually talk about this. This is their value. It makes people feel protected. Following the 1920 season, new aerial imaginaries emerged within and alongside these formations. Some of these were familiar, such as the use of satellites and sensors affixed to planes to render fires more finely detectable and knowable, illustrated through an expanding range of remote sensing companies that offered imagery and analysis as a service, and there at the time a dozen. With these came actors unfamiliar to the bushfire sector, seeking to publicize the possibilities of deploying big data sets and drones to detect and even suppress fires. Through the judicious use of drones, the Minderoo Foundation and its representatives have said all dangerous fires in Australia could be extinguished within an hour of ignition by 2025. A research group at the ANU are aimed at the more specific goal to detect an experimental fire within 1 minute and suppress it within 5 minutes using drones and autopiloted water gliders, these like little water bombs attached to parachutes. These efforts in Australia are paralleled more prominently internationally by those of Lockheed Martin, which have been eager to publicize their trials of repurposing Stalker XE drones developed and used in military surveillance and target acquisition, and therefore implicated in unknown thousands of extralegal deaths, into fire spotters, useful for protecting America's many fire-prone communities. Only such military drones, in fact, are actually capable of being deployed on the dry and stormy days when our current strategies are overwhelmed. There's a lot to explore here. For example, for me, the interactions between different forms of platform capitalism as tech entrepreneurs seek to enclose emergency response through platform-based solutions, and the perpetuation of problematic discourses of warfare in relationship to emergency management. Atherton Cardi, a VP from Lockheed Martin, has described their drones as, quote, always the right tool for the job, enabling the company to keep both the warfighter and the firefighter front and center. And as in the US, the underpinning arguments for these technologies in Australia have been community and firefighter safety. In press releases and news reporting surrounding these initiatives, proponents have sought to underline how ground and aerial firefighting are both dangerous, perilous even, with the latter in particular involving pilots flying in conditions where other aircraft are grounded. Drones should, in the words of one agency leader to me, do the boring and dirty jobs for us. Or to quote an industry booster, they would, quote, supplement and complement the current capability, not replace it. The logic at work is therefore one of substitution and expansion, where the existing aerial formation is sedimented further. Some human labor is subtracted out, some tools are added, the state and its contractors maintain their respective monopolies on our smoke-logged skies. So I'll close with some preliminary observations about the interface between emergency management agencies and tech companies, which I've been researching particularly since 2020. It's an interface, I would say, of mutual frustration, as these are largely unfamiliar actors with disparate understandings of research and development, though the emerging pattern resembles what Jesse Goldstein, writing about clean tech, has conceptualized as non-disruptive disruption. Though framed in terms of revolutionary and systematic change, made possible through avowedly new aerial views and analyses and often tinged in the language of participation, the favored technologies and projects actually offer small improvements or new uses of existing technology, disciplined according to the singular power of sector incumbents, namely the federal and state government agencies. Thinking of emergency management, if engagements and entanglements with drones and other technologies are to transform into entrapments, as theorized by Fish and Richardson, then it will likely be because they are able to integrate with the political, economic, and affective appeals of existing aerial formations.
Thank you so much, Tim. There's a lot that we could pick up on, but I'd like to start with the question of care, since you each spoke about it in different ways. And I wondered what you thought a better ethic of care might look like, or a ethic of care that is not so sedimented, not so readily co-opted, etc. What does care look like when we're talking about the skies and the potential of technologies like drones to transform them?
Over the last 2 days, I've been digesting, I think, the very first panel and the ideas of care that were brought forward in that. And to me, it really is our orientation. I put the harms around technologies such as drones in the same bucket as around biometric technologies. I think our setting at the moment is that they're permitted unless prohibited, and I think a care ethic would embed prohibited unless permitted, that we would reset that orientation, and we do that through, I think, instead of thinking of it just as a private transaction between private individuals, I want a drone, my convenience overrides all other interests, or we have a particular need in a particular area. That whole frame, I think, can be adjusted if we put a more societal forward, prohibited unless permitted.
I'm not really sure how to answer that. It's really quite difficult because I think it depends what we're talking about. I mean, yesterday when we were listening to the Humanitech sort of discussions there, the whole idea of do no harm is, I think a useful rule of thumb. But then what do you do when, for instance, we employ certain sort of regulations or rules around their particular use? So, for instance, we talk about, the permissibility of using drones in military campaigns or to perform some form of violence. But there's rules around that. And I think that is still insufficient here because it's permitting a particular form of violence. And then we're in the category of thinking about just war, and ethics related to that, which are pretty much skewed towards permitting that level of violence. So even, when we think here about the range of collateral damage that, it goes into constructing the rules around, strikes, then that's still a perimeter of permissible killing that takes place. So to speak of that in terms of an ethics of care, and again, an ethics of care is going to be different depending if you speak to a military commander who is going to be thinking about the ethics of care that he or she has towards their personnel on the ground, or an ethics of care towards civilians who are going about their daily lives. I think care, again, still becomes complicated. And I'd love to have an easy answer to that, but I just don't know if there is one. So it's sort of, I find it troubling that we can't sort of, well, at least I can't sort of come to some sort of, decisive point with that. But I suppose opening up to question might lead us somewhere with it.
I think my co-panelists have said much smarter things than I'm possibly going to say, but I'll just venture that, like everybody, I guess I'm ambivalent about the language of care. We all know probably very well established critiques of care and STS, particularly people like Michelle Murphy, Marie-Pierre de Bellacasa, always has this ambivalence. And when I think about it in relationship to emergency management, emergency management is so much about care, right, in a kind of in a clear way, and contains within it, obviously, those ambivalences, and that there are forms of violence that emergency managers have to do in order to create a care outcome. I think of the one that's possibly, one that springs to mind here in Victoria. One of the kind of key ways in which we try to prevent bushfires is by burning the bush. That involves incinerating hectares of the bush. That's a form of violence in many people's eyes, but to produce a careful outcome. Mm-hmm. But I think the thing it brings back to me is that this language of care is so often not all that useful without justice. And that's the thing I come back to. These care formations are ossified, sedimented in place. They're so hard to question. They're like, I'm trying to do something on behalf of these people. How can you criticize me? But underneath it is a fundamental set of inequities. And we can only really get to those not with the language of care, but maybe just care plus justice.
Yeah, I was thinking as you were speaking, Tim, about how care is often mobilized in the drone warfare context, for example, to say it's more precise. This is a more accurate and more precise way of going about things, and we see that same idea get mobilized, perhaps in a different form, in what you're talking about with large data sets and the analysis of bushfire situations or potential bushfires, where more data becomes a way of doing more care. In the context of drone war, it's more precise application of warfare means, yes, lethal violence, but to fewer people, or care towards pilots who, rather than flying dangerous planes, are protected from those impacts. But then, of course, one of the ways that drones are often talked about as being a potential life-saving technology is through things like emergency delivery of medical supplies to people in remote situations, or who don't have ready access to, for various reasons. They might have accessibility limitations that don't allow them to easily go to somewhere where they need to get regular medicines, or in a disaster situation they might be cut off from medical access. So there's also this way that that drones, I think, in those circumstances have these like very potentially really positive impacts for people. And so that question perhaps goes back to what Julia was saying about when do we want to permit these kinds of technologies. I wondered too, though, about the role of labour and work, which I think was featured in all three of your brief talks, and I just wondered if you could speak a little bit more about that. And Tim, I was thinking about how you finished with the idea that some aspects of the work of emergency management changes when you deal with the sky differently. And I just wondered if you could say a little bit more about that, and then maybe whoever else would like to jump in on this question of labour, or ask one another questions too, if you'd like.
Yeah, I think what it makes me think of is, as I was saying at the end there, this like mutual frustration that's occurred in the last few years between tech companies that have wanted to get into emergency management, have kind of said, here we have solutions, please come and use them, and finding emergency management agencies they're very conservative by nature, because they're relied upon to never fail, and so doing anything new is always very risky. And along with that comes a labour question of any time one of these solutions is offered, is who will do this work? And if it can't be done by people who already exist within the sector, it's instantly like the tone around it is just off. It just goes sour. And I think that goes back to this what I'm kind of thinking of as this very kind of sedimented formation. Is partly because there is a labour force that we have over the last 50 years delegated this responsibility to, legally, culturally, socially, economically. And they are now very set in their place. And so any kind of tech solution that comes in and says, well, we can automate this, is automatically has already been met with immense hostility. So I think that possibly the best example of this is, and we've seen this with recent flood events, the forms of voluntary, what they call spontaneous volunteering that occur around emergencies are a permanent problem for agencies that they just, again, don't know what to do with, because it doesn't fit within their labour paradigm. And so I think drones like these spontaneous volunteers, it's just like, how does this fit in? Yeah, that would be my immediate thought.
Yeah, I think when it comes to the sort of labour aspects that I've looked at in terms of drone warfare, and this, you know, and I only come across it intermittently in a lot of the literature that I read, is that despite the claims that drones are autonomous and they're economical and that they're precise weapons, they require a lot of human work, a lot of human labour to go into them. So everything from research and development to investment to maintaining drones on the ground to operating to analysing the data that comes through with them as well. And then there's I think what is less spoken about is the unseen labour of what happens in the aftermath of the drone strike. You know, villages that have to be rebuilt, lives that have to be restored, economic consequences for families whose, you know, members have been who have suffered drone strikes. So in certain families, you could lose the main breadwinner, for instance. This is unseen labour that is often invisible in these nice, neat narratives about drones as surgical, clean, economical weapons to use. So, I mean, I know I'm sort of constantly giving the doom and gloom side of this, but it just strikes me that when we think about these technologies, we're privileging a certain type of work, a certain type of narrative to, you know, at the expense of others, I guess.
My two short points are, the first, I think, one of my challenges over the period of the remainder of ADM+S, which I can't say every time, is I think that there's a real opportunity to respond to some of the claims that are made about the jobs that will be created from AI and automation and the economic value of that, and in particular, what that money is going from. So in the digital economy strategy, we saw massive reductions in budgeting around noted areas where you have labour shortages, such as in nursing and education, into the possibility of jobs in the drone space. I think legally they're misleading and deceptive claims on which we have made economic decisions. So I think that's a big target, and you know, the numbers, we've found absolute contradictions to orders of magnitude between the projections that are made. So I think they're utterly spurious. Whenever I talk to someone from a consulting company, they seem to be back of the envelope calculations. The second is more of a sort of aesthetic of the cities that we want to live in, and I don't know if anyone's had the experience of seeking out what looks like an attractive restaurant on Uber, only to discover it's a ghost kitchen and you're not allowed in and it's all walled off. And I think the image I have of these, of the tens of thousands of drone vision of companies like Google Wing, is that we'll just have these warehouses where people are making coffee and food sort of shunted away. There'll be no coffee shops, there'll be no restaurants, and I really question whether that's the kind of city we want to live in, really. And I think they happen in a micro way. So the novelty factor is what's leading, rather than a consideration of the difference between getting coffee from a machine or from a person.
We've got about 10 minutes left, I think, so it might be a good time to go to the audience if there are questions. Does anyone out there want to ask us anything?
I'm not sure.
Yes. I saw Nacho first. Yeah.
I'll go quick. The airspace is really focusing minds, a really great discussion. I wanted to ask about the use of drones to create counter expertise, because I'm aware and have been involved in some projects where non-governmental organizations and activists use drones to create public knowledge. So the use of drones to map the safety zone above Jerusalem. So drones are magnetically banned from that zone, and so Hagit Kaiser, an artist, mapped the boundaries of that militarized zone using drones. And also the use of drones to document land, titles to land. So in Southern America, where some communities, their land ownership is contested by local government, and they then use drones to document their sort of use of land over time, which can then accrue ownership over time. So, I mean, I'm really interested in that sort of public knowledge application. And so I have two questions, I think. One, you know, do we need to add knowledge or expertise to hope and justice, or like public knowledge? But also, how does this sort of civic experimentation with drones, how does that sit in relation to maybe a more punitive approach that one would like to propose in relation to big tech?
It's a fantastic question, and I think you know, the work being done by public labs or forensic architecture and other organisations, Human Rights Watch have used drones in atrocity investigations and so on, does certainly point to a different approach. Is there anyone would like to respond?
No, I think Yuch's point is an excellent one, and you know, the use of drones can be a very powerful form of resistance, and I think this is something that I don't necessarily want to discount when, you know, I talk about drones and how awful the militarized drones absolutely are. I think it does come down to this. I think, you know, in that simple equation, we can, you know, siphon off the drones that kill, the drones that maim, from those that serve this public knowledge purpose. It's interesting that you raise it in terms of mapping as well, because, you know, mapping from the sky was a form of colonial control, but it can also be a form of resisting, you know, speaking to power in that way too. So I guess the duality of these technologies, how they're put to use, I think it's sort of, in many ways it goes down to us as humans and the sort of, you know, logics around care and around violence that we deploy them for. So there's no easy answer to that, but yes, recognising that it's, you know, an object is not used in solely one horrendous way opens up that level of hope as well, definitely.
For my part, I think there's a very deliberate conflation of commercial big tech delivery drones, which I think have a very poor use case, basically indulgence and convenience in urban areas, with, in Australia, surf life-saving drones, farmer drones, resistance drones, like all these other projects. And I think we can cleave them. They're, to me, very different. Apart from the sort of object of curiosity, I think they're really different entities. And so I'm all for mapping the you know, sites of control, and I don't think that there's anything in resisting indulgence economy drones that would prevent that, for my part.
Yeah, the one I think of in relationship to fire is not is in relationship to First Peoples cultural burns and use of drones in mapping cultural heritage sites, where they are able to create something that's visually compelling, can travel, that can be mapped again and again over time. Yeah, I think there are, and I agree with Julie, I think these kinds of civic epistemologies can be cleaved from the kinds of things that we're talking about.
Jathan?
Great, thank you. It's a very interesting panel. I mean, we've been hearing about drones in, you know, radically different application areas and with different approaches to oversight or lack thereof from government, civil society, and others. And, you know, as some of you are well aware, you know, due to my work on insurance technology, I now often see the world with actuarial eyes. And so I'm curious, what approaches and discussions are you seeing to ensuring drones in these various spaces, especially if we consider the enormous influence and often very shadowy and private influence that the insurance industry has in establishing standards and enforcing requirements for all the things that govern, well, you know, most things in our lives, with transport obviously being a really giant one.
Great question.
I only know anecdotally that some European-based startups have been unable to launch because of insurance problems. So I don't know how that problem is being solved more broadly. I think it's fascinating.
That's, yeah, a question, I think, beyond my scope, because I think we don't really deal with questions in terms of militarized drones in relation to insurance is it, Michael? I've not come across anything in that realm. And I imagine because a lot of the development of it is either, you know, secretive or highly classified or whatever, it's interesting. And I think, yeah, I don't know.
I'd say in emergency management, from my limited experience, it's a barrier to use because you're asking people to use a technology that could start a fire on a high-risk day. And so this has been a barrier to uptake, is that people don't have the training, and therefore if they don't have the high enough training, then they can't get the insurance coverage. But I think that will probably change with time because people are getting that training. And they do get insurance for flying planes when other planes are grounded. But yeah, I think it's a key part of the financing that's not really explored.
Yeah, drone batteries like to blow up, which is a problem in certain
One of the most damaging
contexts.
fires in 2019, 2020 was from a military helicopter.
Yeah.
Just off its what do you call that? Flashlight.
I don't know if I can add a specific piece of detail, Jathan, but I suspect that you know, the drone delivery piloting that we've seen in Australia, one of the reasons why it's happened in such close relationship with the regulatory bodies and with very careful blessing from the Civil Aviation Safety Authority and with very carefully chosen sites is to try to mitigate that risk right down. How much of it is a barrier to the larger scale development of the industry is a really excellent question. Certainly, like accreditation and certification for pilots and so on is an important part of the equation too. You know, you can get a commercial drone piloting license for less than $3,000 Australian and about 5 days of training. There are limitations, of course, on flying around people and so on, but it is like a pretty accessible, at least, I mean, $3,000 isn't nothing, but it's also not like a huge amount of money to then be able to go and like immediately do a new profession and a very complicated one with potential risks for people and environment and lands and so on. It's a really good question, and I'm sure that they face insurance concerns as well. Any other questions from the audience? All right, well, it's almost 4:10, and so we're almost at the hour, and I think it might be nice to leave it there and give everybody a little break before we go on to the next session. I'm being signaled that it will be a 10-minute break before we go on to the film screening and launch this afternoon. So thank you all very much, and thank you again to Tim, Chris, and Julia, and thank you, Sarah and Tao, for organising this fantastic event. Real privilege to be here with you all. Thank you so much.